Hi, Dan.
Hi, Harold.
Well, very interesting read for readers for doing this before the story's published, but Saturday's print edition and it'll be online as well around that time. But you've looked at multiplexes, which, the government brought in some new rules allowing the provincial government allowing up to 4 units on traditional sort of single family lots.
Yep.
The city already had that sort of thing in place, as did a few other cities. So you're just looking, you wanted to see what sort of the uptake was on this and how they're playing out in neighborhoods. And so what did you find?
Yeah. So as you say, this is we're basically a year and a half now since this
Okay.
new zoning came into effect in most BC cities that allows multiple units on residential lots if that's what people want to build. If people want to build a single detached house, they can still do that too. But basically, the provincial government forced cities to update their zoning to allow at least 3 or 4 units per property, per residential property, or as many as 6 if it's close to transit, a certain distance from transit. And so it's a year and a half now. So these buildings are actually starting to go up. They're getting built in neighborhoods, and we're hearing pushback in some neighborhoods. And as you might imagine, some of the most kind of intense pushback we're hearing is in neighborhoods that have not seen a lot of different kinds of development. So I spoke with a couple of people in North Burnaby. There's a part of North Burnaby that it's just single detached houses really at this point, and it has been kind of forever. Um, and it's sort of a classic kind of suburban neighborhood with front yards and lots of little bungalows or kind of World War II era. And a couple of the people in this neighborhood have been very upset to see some of these big, boxy 3 and even 4-story buildings going up, and they say they're too close to the property line. They're going to cast shadows on their neighbors' yards, and they're afraid it's going to cause havoc for parking and traffic. And so I spoke with some folks in North Burnaby, and Burnaby, was one of the Burnaby actually responded. The city of Burnaby a few months ago came back and said, "We've heard your concerns. We're going to change the zoning to basically shrink the maximum allowable building size," because the province didn't force, like Burnaby was saying, they have to allow a certain number of units per property. And I think there's certain rules about what they have to allow. But Burnaby had allowed actually bigger buildings than they needed to. So they went from these recent changes that went into effect last month in December. They shrunk the maximum building size from 4 stories to 3 stories. It still complies with the provincial legislation, but it means that the buildings are going to be a bit smaller than what they had initially allowed. So Burnaby has kind of pulled back there. But then there's a number of, as you mentioned, there's a number of municipalities in BC that were actually kind of going this direction even before the province kind of came in with their own legislation forcing all cities to do it. So Kelowna was actually the first kind of bigger city in BC, and maybe one of the first in Canada. Like a decade ago, Kelowna started pre-zoning hundreds of lots, allowing multiple units on these residential lots. And I spoke with the head of Kelowna's housing policy, and he said, you're not hearing a lot of backlash right now in Kelowna about this because people are kind of used to this. Kelowna was also, I didn't know this, but Kelowna started allowing carriage houses, kind of laneway houses, like a little house, separate home on the same property. They started allowing those way like 10 or 15 years before Vancouver did. And I remember when Vancouver started allowing it in 2009, it was a big deal. And I remember we were hearing, oh, Vancouver's allowing this new kind of exciting, new pioneering, new kind of housing, but Kelowna had actually been doing it for a while before that. So anyway, it sounds like in Kelowna, the people are not freaking out about this as much because they're kind of more used to this idea. It's been around for a while. They're kind of more accustomed to seeing these buildings. But in places where they haven't seen stuff like this, people are quite upset and worried about
Right.
what it'll look like in the future.
Right. I mean, without getting bogged down in too many numbers, I mean, just in terms of orders of magnitude, it does seem that Kelowna, as you say, because I guess they've been ahead of it, they've had a few hundred built. And Vancouver's had over 500 applications. I think
Yeah.
Surrey's had 600 applications, and
Yeah,
as we know, we don't know how many of those will actually be built,
sure.
but some are in progress. One of the complaints you do hear is more of a visual complaint about how
Yes.
boxy some of these things can look,
Yeah.
right? And we've
Yeah.
we've taken pictures of them,
Yeah.
and they don't necessarily fit with the neighborhood. I think maybe that was one of the complaints in Burnaby, as you were saying.
Oh yeah, for sure. That's what people are worried about. They say, like, in some cases it looks like it's towering over the building beside it. And but some of the proponents of these kinds of buildings will say um, that it is still up to city halls, city planning departments to come up with design guidelines for how close you can build to the property line, what the
Right.
setbacks need to be, what the shape of the building needs to be. City halls do still control these design guidelines, and some of the proponents of these kinds of buildings, there's an organization called Small Housing BC that kind of advocates for this type of building. They're saying if you walk in a lot of neighborhoods in Vancouver or some other municipalities that have allowed, because there are places where this has been allowed for a very long time. If you go, in Mount Pleasant in Vancouver, there's a lot of older buildings that were built decades ago that are effectively multiplexes just before anybody was calling them that, where you have a 3, sometimes a 4-story building, effectively a small apartment block mixed into a neighborhood, and there might be a single house next door and a duplex across the street, and then a fourplex, or like a big old house that's been carved up into 5 units. And in some neighborhoods where it's been like that, it's kind of just, you have different buildings of different ages and different sizes that kind of coexist. But I think it does feel very abrupt if there's only been one kind of building in a neighborhood for a very long time, forever, and then you have something that seems very boxy. And so but the proponents are sort of describing this as growing pains, like not, and I mean, one of the experts I spoke with kind of said, you'll recall there was a time when the Vancouver Special was derided. People hated these houses. They thought they were ugly, and these houses were designed to be cost efficient. They were designed to serve, you could have multi-generational living because you could have potentially a kitchen upstairs and a kitchen on the main floor. So you could have immigrant families from Europe, from Asia, who wanted to be able to live with different generations in the same house. Vancouver Specials, even though it's just a detached house, it's not like a high density housing form, but they were controversial at one time. And then in the 90s, remember, monster houses was a big thing. People were upset. They were still just houses, just a single house, but they were bigger and designed differently than people were accustomed to. And so there is a history of that, and it's understandable. It totally makes sense. And I think there are some well-designed 4 and 5 and 6 unit places that look nice, and maybe some aren't that well designed. It is also true, though, that a lot of the complaints we're hearing are about, or at least most of the ones that I've seen, are buildings that are currently under construction. They're not completed. No one's living there. And that was another one of the points that people brought up, is construction is annoying. There's no way around that. Absolutely. Construction's annoying. But once a building is built, new people move in, you got families, different kinds of people. And people might start to feel differently. Now, of course, those new people are going to come with their own cars, and they're going to make their own noise. So, if people feel like their neighborhoods are too crowded or something, then that could be a new complaint we start to hear. But a lot of these neighborhoods that have not had new kinds of buildings, at least in the city of Vancouver, those neighborhoods, you think about Dunbar, West Point Grey, those neighborhoods that haven't seen very much new kinds of building in the last few decades, their populations have actually shrunk, right? They've not just like stayed level, but they've gone down while the rest of the city and the region have gone up. So, I mean, that's kind of one of the arguments, is that neighborhoods need to be able to change physically to keep pace with the way cities grow and the human population grows.
Do you get a sense of, I know it'll depend on whether it's Surrey or Vancouver, West Side, East Side, whatever, but of what the price point is for one of these units these days?
Yeah, it does. It depends. But I mean, it is certainly true that if you have a neighborhood where you can only build a single detached house, and up until very recently, that was a lot of residential land throughout BC, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are some places where maybe you're allowed to build a duplex. But, for example, the duplex couldn't have basement suites. So that's one of the other kind of smaller effects of, I don't know if it's smaller necessarily, but it's probably one of the lesser understood effects of this provincial legislation. So in Surrey, for example, we touched on Surrey earlier.
Yeah.
Surrey previously allowed duplexes in a lot of area, but you couldn't have basement suites. You could have a house with a basement suite or duplex with no suites. Now, duplexes can have suites. So that's 4 units where previously you could have 2, the same amount of land. And that's actually a lot of Surrey's building permits for these small scale multi-unit housing. There's actually way more of them are for duplexes, carriage houses, new duplexes with suites, new things that are allowed. Only a handful of them are actually for like the 3, 4, 5 unit houseplex. The vast majority are for these other types that weren't previously allowed. Anyway, but in terms of price point, like I spoke with a builder in the sort of the Victoria area. She's based in Esquimalt. They're building in Esquimalt and in Victoria. And they recently finished a project that had small 3-bedroom homes, like quite small. They were like less, I think 900 some odd square feet. So that's small for 3-bedroom.
Yeah.
But selling for $675,000 for a new build. And they had larger 3-bedrooms, like 1,325 square feet for $890,000. So certainly not cheap compared to housing in some Canadian cities, but it is definitely cheaper than a newly built single detached house on that same property would be. Now, it's true that single detached house would probably have more square footage and would have more private outdoor space. You'd maybe have your own front yard and your own backyard. But if all you can build is a single detached house, then the price point is kind of here. Whereas if you can build other kinds of options, it creates more options that are accessible to more people. If you want to live in a single detached house in Esquimalt and you want to buy a property and build a new single detached house to live in, you can still absolutely do that. But the number of people who can afford that is much smaller than a generation ago or 2 generations ago. So by allowing these other types, it just, in theory, there's more, it creates housing that's accessible to a much bigger percentage of the population.
Is there any concern, maybe not Victoria, but in a place like Vancouver, of these multiplexes displacing affordable rental? I think about the houses that have 3 and 4, they're carved up into 3 or 4 units, like rental units. And if you rip those down, and kind of like what used to happen in Burnaby, but on a larger scale, where you rip down affordable rental and build for market condos.
So there's definitely worries about that. I would say for sure. But municipalities do have the ability, if that is something that municipal politicians or city staffers are worried about, municipalities do have the ability to create tenant protection policies, as Vancouver has done and others have, New Westminster. You can create tenant protection policies that says if a developer if a developer buys a house that has 4 tenants living in it and they want to knock it down and build a new 4-plex, they can do that, but they're required to provide the tenants with XYZ. And in the case of in Vancouver with the Broadway plan, where they were expecting to see a fair amount of redevelopment, the tenant protections, the city council at the time said they were the strongest tenant protections in Canada. Tenants even got sort of the right of first refusal. If you're living in a 1-bedroom unit and your property gets redeveloped to build a new building, you get the option, if you want, of moving into a similar 1-bedroom unit. It might be smaller, but you get, in theory, a brand new build at the same rent you were paying before, which is something that certainly wasn't existing in Burnaby when Metrotown was kind of going through that huge redevelopment that saw a lot of tenants displaced.
But these wouldn't be this multiplex wouldn't be rebuilt as rental. It would be rebuilt as
no.
So what rights would compensation would those folks get who are being displaced?
I don't know. I guess it would be up to municipalities in terms of the provincial legislation sets out rules for if you evict someone, what they're entitled to. So there are rules around how much notice they get and how much financial compensation they get, but municipalities can add more on top of that if they wanted to.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Thanks, Dan.
Great. Thanks, Harold.